Much less than an elitist bet.
Right.
See why you can get really. This is totally a father and snotty.
Yeah, but like, oh, you're gonna give you. Yeah, it's like, all right, well, we do a lot of things. Yeah, most people will figure it out by the common last name or the commonly weird first names. But one of those gives it away. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, it's been fun to work with him. I'm sad he couldn't make it down today. A couple of the students over here are.
And our mission is to advance understanding and the practice of constitutional government, ordered liberty, and the rule of law. And so today we're discussing this book, The Myth of Left and Right, How the Political Spectrum Misleads and Harms America. And we are glad that one of the co-authors of the book is with us. And we have up here some what we call principal discussants. So they're just here to help us jumpstart the conversation But we really want the conversation to live more out here where we are sharing our thoughts about it. And I'm going to introduce our facilitator for the conversation today, and then she'll take it from there. So this is Dr. Savannah Eccles Johnston. She's an assistant professor of political science at Salt Lake Community College. She had a fellowship with the political science, the American Political Science Association, in a fellowship in the U.S. Senate, and she teaches about political science at Salt Lake Community College, and she specializes in American political thought and American constitutionalism. And right now she's researching is focusing on the illiberal shifts in American conservatism, which is directly about what this book talks about. So we'll turn it over to you, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Can you hear me? Excellent. Hi, folks. So happy you're here. I'm going to just go through and introduce our lovely principal discussants here. Brief overview of the book, and then we're just going to go straight into discussion time. So here to my left is Stockton Hawes. He's a Tocqueville Fellow here at UVU, political science undergrad, and he's Verlan Lewis's teaching apprentice. So he won't have anything bad to say about Verlan Lewis today. And then this is the fabulous Becky Edwards. So Becky Edwards was in the Utah State House between 2008 and 2018, representing District 20. My parents' district. She was my representative growing up. And then she ran 2 great campaigns for the U.S. Senate and then for the 2nd district in 2022. And then, of course, we have one of the 2 co-authors here. This is Verlan Lewis. He's the Sterling Scholar of Constitutional Studies here at UVU, professor of political science. And what did you say, the better half, the better looking half of the authors?
That's right.
Of the co-authors. Right, okay, that's what it was. Okay, so what is this book? The Myth of Left and Right. So the authors attempt to take aim at this essentialist theory of ideology, which posits that all these bundle of policies come from a single essence, that there is something truly conservative and something truly liberal that you can attach all policies to. They say this is a remarkably dangerous way to view politics because it puts us into a righteous camp, a good camp, and an evil camp, a bad camp. Instead, they posit a social theory of ideology, which says that, no, there's no underlying essence that unifies policy positions. It's just tribal affiliation. So you accept a certain policy bundle because you identify with the tribe of liberals or because you identify with the tribe of conservatives. And by recognizing this tribalism, we can confront it and move towards a healthier political discourse in this country. So, Verlan, if it's okay, I'd like to start first with how you came up with this book. Where does this book come from? Because I think it's so timely.
Okay, yeah, thanks. And I'll just start by saying thank you to the Center for Constitutional Studies for hosting this book club discussion today. I'm thrilled to be a part of the Center for Constitutional Studies at UVU. In my biased opinion, I think it's one of the best things going on in the state of Utah right now and even in the country. And the reason I think that is because of the mission of the Center for Constitutional Studies, which is to promote constitutional literacy, and in particular to promote an understanding of the practices and ideas that are necessary for the perpetuation of constitutional self-government, ordered liberty, and the rule of law, as we say in our mission statement. And so I think this book connects up with our mission as a center, because I think one of the most important ideas and practices that promotes constitutional self-government in America is the idea and practice of pluralism, which was perhaps most famously articulated by Publius in the Federalist Papers. The idea that a plurality of groups and ideas and viewpoints in society can prevent
Publius was worried about in the Federalist Papers.
So just love the Center for Constitutional Studies and thrilled to be a part of it. Okay, so how did the book come about? Yeah, great question. So as Savannah said, I co-authored this book with my brother. And, he's definitely the first author. He gets the lion's share of the credit or blame, as you may see fit, for the ideas and what we say in the book. So the first thing about this book is that I simply had the good fortune to be related to someone who's really smart and allowed me to join with them on this project. But yeah, I think this really came out of a brotherly conversation. I still remember where I was. It was about 17 years ago, and he pointed out to me that the meanings of conservatism and liberalism are constantly changing, and that there's more than one issue in politics. And it's something that I've just been thinking about ever since, that we've been talking about ever since, that we've been writing about ever since. But I think the importance of the book also came out of my own personal experiences and interactions with people, and also just following what's going on in the news. I've noticed increasingly in my life, it's harder and harder to have rational, civil conversations with people about politics. Maybe you've experienced that yourselves, I don't know. But that's been my experience personally, is so often when the subject of politics comes up, I'll start saying something about my views about X, Y, or Z, and if I'm critical of something that the Trump administration did, people will say, well, that's because you leftists believe X, Y, or Z. Or, like, no. I just happen to disagree with these other things. There's these other things that I agree with that the Republican Party is doing, and I'm happy to, or vice versa. If I say something critical about what the Biden administration is doing, they say, well, that's because you conservatives are all this way. I'm like, no. I happen to agree with these things, but I disagree with these other things. And so I find that very frequently in our political discourse, we try to lump people together and we assume so many things about them. And so that's it's just something I've noticed in my own personal interactions with people. And then as we look at what's going on in the country, the survey data is pretty clear that the anger and the hostility is increasing among ordinary Americans. You know, the American National Election Studies has some good survey data on this. The Pew Research Center does some good data on this. That the amount of anger or willingness that people are willing to see violence done to their political opponents because of their disagreements with them is just increased dramatically in recent years. And again, I think it comes back to this monism, this idea that there's just one issue in politics, there's two sides to that one big issue, and the purpose of politics for many people is not to understand, but to defeat or destroy their enemies. So I think that's, for me, why I was interested in joining this book project and writing about it, because I care about the American experiment in constitutional self-government, and I'm really concerned about its future in this country.
Thank you. So if you have questions for Verlan Lewis during this book club, just jump in and ask. You can ignore whatever question that I've asked and just direct it to him instead. That's fine. When you do give your responses or your questions, say whatever you want to say, we're going to bring a mic around to you so we can all hear you. So just like raise your hand and they'll bring it to you. Okay, so the first question I wanted to start with is, oh, sorry.
We have one.
Oh, we already have a question? Excellent.
My name is David Farnsworth, and just for the record, I teach Constitution at ElderQuest, which is sponsored by UVU. And I enjoyed your book. It conforms with my confirmation biases. Let me start by saying, when somebody asks what party I belong to, I say arrogantly, I'm an enlightened neutralist. In other words, I won't identify with either tribe. But in the state of Utah particularly, that disenfranchises me. The tribes have so much hold on the way elections are held and so on. So I think you've examined the issues, you've explained them well, you've pointed out your 5 points that we can do to change. But how do we overcome the hold that tribalism has on the system? For example, right now in our state legislature, a certain group is trying to pull back the right of list voting, which was enacted a while ago, and it was supposed to be a 5-year experiment, but they're trying to pull it back. So how do we break that hold so that we can get to granularity in politics, and we who are thinking that way have a voice again?
I'm happy to jump in on that. I'm sure others might have really insightful things to say about that. So thanks for your question. And yeah, I think just for starters, you talked about confirmation bias. That's one of the dangers, I think, of monism, is that it promotes so much dogmatism, and it gives us an easy way out. It doesn't force us to do hard thinking about issues. It just allows us to declare for a side and then assume that we're correct about everything. So I think one of the benefits of discarding left-right thinking is it promotes more intellectual humility. That, you know, we're always open to being wrong, and with new evidence, you know, if you all bring good evidence today to say why I should adopt the left-right spectrum, I'm happy to take it. So I think intellectual humility is really important in our discourse. Okay, so the question about political parties. Yeah, so this is, I think in some ways we're fighting an uphill battle to get rid of left-right thinking for a few reasons we talk about in the book. One of those reasons you've pointed to, which is that political parties have an incentive to prop up the myth of left and right. Because right, if you got a letter from the Republican Party saying, "Dear Mr. Farnsworth, we're the Republican Party and we stand for a basket of issue positions, some of which are good, some of which are wrong. Please donate to our party, thanks." Are you likely to donate, right? No. But if you get a letter from the Republican Party saying, "Dear Mr. Farnsworth, we are the conservative Republican Party that is right about everything, and we are fighting the forces of evil leftism in this country. And the country's at peril if the leftists win. Please donate," you're more likely to donate, right? So the parties have an incentive to prop up this myth. So I'm not confident or optimistic that we'll get rid of it. What does give me a little bit of hope is the fact that for most of American history, we didn't have the left-right spectrum. We've always had two major political parties, but we haven't always had the delusion that we can place individuals and parties on an imaginary line in space. And so if we've done it before, hopefully we can do it again. That's my little bit of optimism. And so our view is, and I think people would have a healthier relationship to parties if they kind of went back to what we did for most of American history. Up until the 1930s and 40s, when people thought about politics, they said, okay, I have my issue positions that I care about that derive from my own values, my own principles, my faith, my own experiences. This is what I care about. And you look out and you see two parties and you say, neither party is going to agree with me on everything. Of course not. How could that be possible? Statistically impossible. But this party has more of the stuff I like than the other party. Maybe I agree with them on 60% of the stuff and this party on 30% of the stuff, so I'll vote for this party. That would be a rational thing to do, but you would have an arm's length, and you would recognize that from election to election, the parties might change their issue positions, and you're updating your views and assessments of those two parties. What would be irrational to do is to say, this is my party, and everything in this party is correct, and everything in the other party is wrong, because everything in my party is bound together by this good and enlightened philosophy, and everything in the other party is bound together by an evil and benighted philosophy. That would be irrational, but that's what we do when we assume a left-right spectrum with one party on one side of the spectrum and one party on the other side of the spectrum. And you can see how that delusion of omniscience, that I'm right about everything and these other people are all wrong about everything and my party and group is right about everything, leads to the kind of hostility and violence and anger that we see increasingly in our politics. So it's, I don't think, a coincidence that as the left-right spectrum has increased in its use in our political discourse since the 1920s and 30s, and you can look at this actually with Google Ngram. It's been an exponential rise since the 30s and 40s. The anger and the hostility and the vitriol has also increased exponentially in our political discourse.
Well, thank you. Maybe you who have experienced the hold of one tribe over the other, perhaps more than any of us, how would you respond to the need to break through that tribalism? Re-education, yes. Should we demand that every high school senior in the state of Utah read your book? I think that would be great, and you would love it too. But I don't think that's going to happen. How do we break through the hold and so people like you have a chance.
You know, I love this question, and I think it's so relevant, especially with the principles that were spoken about in the book. And for those of us who have been around for enough election cycles that we have been able to see positions change with one party. And there's so many amazing examples, many that were new to me in the book, where I thought, oh, I'd never thought about it that way before, where we'd seen, you know, big issues, tax policy, foreign intervention, issues like that had really shifted between parties through the years. So as an electorate, we have to be, I think it's helpful. I mean, it's helpful when we are more thoughtful, our questions are issue related, topic related, principle related, and when we get an answer that is, I'm right because I stand against this other party, that we double down with another very thoughtful question, and we do not let our elected officials get by with this kind of tribalism content that I think it brings us nowhere. I think that's the very thing that's disenfranchising so many of our young people who are like, this whole thing is a mess. And it doesn't need to be. Having conversations about and debates about ideas, that's a great thing. That's founding principle of our country. And we want more of that. But what we have right now, this demonization and the othering and the kind of simplistic, lazy view of politics and parties, I think is doing none of us any good. So for those who are doing it right, let's reward them, not just with votes, but also with pointing out that they are being a thoughtful representative, that they're actually answering questions that are related to principles rather than, you know, just pointing fingers. And then, you know, we're just coming up on what's going to be a fascinating campaign year. And, you know, I'm newly made the co-chair of the Utah Debate Commission. So we're an independent, nonpartisan organization that hosts debates with media partners and university partners, one of which is UVU, across the state, and for all statewide races and the federal races in our state. And so we're digging deep into all of this data and how many people are running and whatnot, just for those races, numbers that we have not seen ever in the history of the state. I mean, it's remarkable, the participation. Now, we do have open Senate seat, we have an open congressional seat, so that makes it, you know, numbers go up. But all the way down to school board seats, we have more candidates participating than ever before. And some of this springs from frustration, righteous rage, whatever you want to call it. But I think if that takes us to a place where we're willing to acknowledge the reality that no one party has ever had a monopoly on the truth, the right way, and we start to use language that fosters that understanding, that we may not be able to completely go away from language of the left and the right, but we can start to think in a more productive way about our conversations and hold our elected officials to a higher standard.
I'd like to run with this for a second and maybe turn it to the audience to give us some of your reflections on this question. Verlan and Hyrum are arguing that it's possible to disentangle the myth of left and right from political parties, and that once you do, political parties can actually strengthen American democracy. Do you think this is possible? Becky goes as far as to say is, well, you can't move us completely away from the left and right spectrum. She's more practical, maybe. How are you reacting to this? Do you think it's possible to save political parties as a strengthening force in American democracy?
Well, maybe one response to that is the only way to democratize Utah would be for everybody to register as a Republican. Because right now, if you not register as a Republican, you're essentially disenfranchised from a lot of what goes on. And so how do we, I mean, we're getting back to the question I raised initially. How do we break the hold far enough that we can actually begin the conversation? Because right now, for example, and I've had this happen, I declare myself an independent because I think that to be what you need to be, you have to sort of be there right now. But to participate, I would have to register as a Republican. But I've had people do that and actually been booed out of the caucuses because they raised a granular issue that was not in favor with those who were in power. So we need to go that way. Media needs to go that way. Education needs to go that way. But it won't happen until we can get a crack in the hold of those who wish to sustain the current system.
All right, you make a great point about tribalism. This gentleman here in the back here, and then we'll come to...
I'm Jeremy Lloyd. I teach U.S. History and Political Science 1100 at Salem Hills High School. In kind of response to your question, I know this is not a how-to book, especially the last chapter, but one of the things they talked about was redirecting our tribal tendencies. And that makes an earlier reference to the idea that to find better tribes, do better with our families, do better with our neighbors, do better with our church associates, service organizations. And as you do that, in light of Utah, for example, when you go to this caucus meetings, you don't go now all by yourself. You now go with people who have now associated with you and know you a lot better. And therefore, you now with a group of individuals or people you didn't bring, but they know you in your community, begin to understand when you bring something up, they understand where you're coming from and not like a 1 minute platform that you have to defend or get booed out. It's just, I know this book doesn't go into details about that. That's just one way I kind of see how that follows, along with the language we would have to incorporate with that as well. And when someone says, oh, you're left or right, you just simply ask and clarify, can you please explain what that means? Because I'm unclear what you mean by left. Well, I mean that means that you're a liberal. Okay, well, I'm still unclear what you mean. What do you mean on an issue? And we just, not to challenge them, but more of like, let's get into that conversation where we start having that dialogue and break down those barriers, and then not be so much lazy sometimes.
That's great. I think Ralph in the back has some thoughts here as well.
I've got two very brief questions to put out there, and you can discuss or not in whatever order you like. But the first is specifically for Professor Johnston, and that is, have you any question or critique or critical question about the Lewis Brothers book? More generally, I was just going to propose this topic. I think we all of us think we are thoughtful and civil and above the fray, and we all would like to see ourselves as not motivated by stupid tribal passions and so forth. So I think we all agree on that. The question, I think in these questions, it's easy to position ourselves above the fray of these other people who have these tribal passions, while we have intelligent and well-considered views on policy issues. But what I invite you to pick a divisive, substantive issue and show us an example of being above the fray and intelligent and untouched by tribal passions.
I think this is why every book club needs a Ralph Hancock, because he will ask a really good question. But actually, I think you should answer this question. I think you have a major critique of the Lewis's book, of this idea that there isn't some essence under politics. Oh, sorry. I'm putting that on Hancock. Okay, there we go. Right, so actually maybe we should pull it back to the basic idea of the book. Is there an actual essence at the basis of our politics, or is there not? Are they correct in the social theory of ideology? How are they explaining themselves, and do you agree or disagree? And I think maybe Stockton, you can respond to this first, and then Becky, you can respond to this, and then of course everyone else can give your thoughts.
Yeah, I think
being in Professor Lewis's class and having taken it myself, he's brought up a lot of these ideas in his classroom. And I think in the beginning I was very much so like there was kind of this inner person within me who was like, I don't know. And I think a lot of people kind of have this internal battle, right? Because I think a lot of us that have grown up with parents that are maybe a little bit more radical or, kind of straight thinking in this way, kind of, I really think there is kind of, there isn't necessarily an essence, but more of like that tribalistic idea that like, in reality, where you live and the people that you surround yourself with and the parents that you have really kind of affect the tribalism or which tribe that you associate with, right? Like there are statistics out there that if you have parents that are both, reside with the Democrat side, then you're more likely to also be Democrat, right? And vice versa with Republican parents. My thoughts, I feel like when I was reading this book, I agreed with a lot of things that Professor Lewis was saying. The only thing I was a little hesitant about was about the ending part of how to actually fix the problem. I think Professor Lewis and his brother talk a lot about how there has been this decline in religion in America, but they've kind of accepted these political ideologies as their religion, so they're very much so kind of close to home. And so if you attack those ideas, then people will become dogmatic, hostile in that nature. And so I was a little hesitant in the sense of, how would this conversation go, right? You go up and you talk to someone and you basically, in a sense, tell them like, well, you have some good ideas. Your party, I think you have some good ideas there, but there might not be everything that your party has that may solve these problems, if that makes sense. And I think people will become really defensive about that. And the answer to how to actually solve this problem, I'm not entirely sure. I think, going granular in some of these ideas that were brought up in the last chapter on how to fix the problem could definitely help and could be kind of like a test run to see if they can kind of fix this problem. But I think in my opinion, if it doesn't necessarily work out the way that it does, then it may be time to change the political system in general through legislation, through maybe an amendment of some sort. I don't know, those are kind of my ideas, so
Yeah,
my
thank you.
thoughts.
Okay, Becky, do you buy into the social theory?
One of the big questions I had at the end of the book was, how do we get the parties to shift? So does it take a super enigmatic leader like we've seen recently who can have policies that actually do not align with traditional policies from that party 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 30 years ago? And is that what it takes? Can it bubble up from everyday people? And I'm reminded for some reason when I think this professor here of US history in the blue tie, your question, or you said that in your class you talk about, or one of your thoughts was you talk about the role of community and churches and families, and maybe those conversations are kind of where it starts. Agree 100%. And it reminded me that when Utah was becoming a state, one of the things, and I feel hesitant to bring this up in a room full of history professors, but my understanding is that in order for us to become a state, we needed robust two-party system of some kind. And I'm looking at you for confirmation. I hope I'm on the right track with this story here. And that as lore would have it, the LDS Church goes in one day in sacrament meeting and just says, all right, here's the line. You're Republicans, you're Democrats, off you go. And they did. And they proceeded to, live their lives as Republicans and Democrats, and voila, we had a two-party system. And I think about what that would be like in today's world if, we're sitting in general conference and everyone on the main level is now Republicans and everyone, or vice versa, or split down the middle, however they divided it. And I think we would have an insurrection of a sort. I honestly do. Because things have gotten so tribal and so dysfunctional in some ways. But I have to reflect and point out some of the good things that have happened of late. And I'm talking about access to the ballot with the, this was in 2014 or 15, the signature pathway to have a parallel path to get access to the primary ballot. That to me was a positive thing. That was something that increased, participation and opened up the doors for that. That we're seeing things try to get clawed back in some of these ways, and with initiatives and petitions here in the state of Utah. I think some positive things have happened. We've seen business and religious leaders and community leaders and electeds come together for, so to your question about, do we have examples of this? And I think we do. We've seen it with non-discrimination statements. We've seen it with immigration compacts that here in Utah that I think have been remarkable examples of people from across the state coming together, and in a way that really was leading out other states. We're like, wow, how did that just happen? And in Utah, that's kind of crazy. They're a supermajority state, and we have fomenting among us conversations like this happening all the time across the state. Books like this being written. Just last night, an organization with the Wheatley Institute, sponsored by Deseret Magazine, and the Wesleyan Theological Seminary, the Washington Cathedral held a seminar with our own Governor Cox and Governor of Maryland, Wes Moore, who's another fabulous book, The Other Wes Moore. But they had a conversation and then a tremendous panel, and it was all about this same kind of issue. How do we have a more robust and productive political system going forward? So I think there's so many examples in the book that I thought were interesting around immigration or free speech or even COVID, and how the right and the left assigned their virtues to their positions, and how they really could have held those very same positions with COVID vaccinations, for example, and instead of using one virtue to describe why they're in that place, they could have chosen about a million other virtues and still held that very same belief. And it's possible for us to look at someone with a different opinion on any of these really complex issues and realize that their values and principles are ones that we also hold, maybe not on that issue, but whether it's fiscal restraint, whether it's compassion, whether it is some other issue, some other principle, we hold those as well and apply them in different ways with different issues. And I think to the extent that we're able to recognize that it's possible that both Democrats and Republicans could be compassionate, both Democrats and Republicans could do better about spending, I think, and if we could be more like 1896 residents of the territory of Utah, I think we'd be off to a good start.
Okay, I have a thought. Can you hear me?
No.
I'm an architecture student here at UVU, and I find this really interesting. I listened to Verlan's book and Hyrum's book. I listened to Hyrum, I guess.
Yeah.
On Audible.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it a lot. Just listened to it in the car. I buy into the social theory, not without reservation, but I have a professor who says encourages us to have a healthy skepticism of everything, which I think is fun and healthy. As far as what we can do, as an architecture student, we spend time in some of our classes researching how architecture affects behavior. The Hall of Flags here on campus is a really long hallway with a row of chairs, and some of our students performed research where they reconfigured the chairs to see how it would affect behavior and create a little pause where people could sit and collaborate instead of sit along a long row of chairs facing a wall. And it completely changed until the janitorial staff changed it back, And I'm also taking an urban planning class. the kind of zoning we're providing, we're kind of saying, okay, all of the single-family residential houses with this size lot and this size of a house with 2-3 garages are here. And then the smaller ones are over here in a cluster. And then the multifamily areas are over here. And apartment complexes, not in my backyard, we're gonna put them over there. To me, the social theory, what it means is that we need to, and I don't know for us to have the answers, but it seems like one of the solutions is to have conversations and more of them, more interaction and a diversity of opinion. But our built environment is not fostering that kind of community. And so one of my goals is to help change that as an architect. And it's interesting to me that these same topics are being talked about in the Center for Constitutional Studies and in a civic discourse as well. The architects are also talking about it. We live in a very disconnected society, and the neighborhoods we're in are a lot of the same. We hear the person next to us has the same kind of house as us, and how different of a life situation do they have? That's not fostering the kind of conversations I think we need to have to foster a better approach to our political system. That was my thoughts.
Hi, so I teach U.S. history, government, and sociology down in St. George at Snow Canyon. And the cross-disciplinary thing is a huge issue for me because sociology is all perspective. And so I don't know, I don't mean to promote another book. I have not read this book yet. I will be getting it this weekend. But Cleon Skousen wrote a book called 5,000 Year Leap, and he uses a political spectrum in there that he says the founding fathers used. So it was on the far left would have been 100% government, tyranny, and on the far right would have been 0% government or anarchy. And really it's kind of a circular kind of a spectrum. But founding fathers looking for us to be somewhere in that balanced middle. And so, left, a little bit left. And, if you run through the parties over since Lincoln, we really go back and forth, right? Republican, Republican, Democrat, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican. And Cleon Skousen would have said that that's what keeps us in the balanced center. And so really the right needs the left and vice versa. So I have students that, they say, well, I had to do this editorial analysis and they're talking about gun control. And they've got some statistics in there that, my dad he's got 500 guns in our garage. And we go shooting all the time and we hunt. But this person wants to limit the Second Amendment, and they're making some good points. The statistics support some of this. And so I'm constantly, we talked about confirmation bias. I would say that I've tried to be confirmation unbiased and say, look, I don't fit in either party either. And so, how we label things, it's difficult to get away from those things. But most of my students are moderates. I have the fringe guys, the MAGA hats, and I got the, other side, pink hair or, whatever the pronoun situation. And so, but other than, that's not the majority of the kids. Most of them tend to be somewhere in the middle. And like you had stated that, we tend to kind of follow our parents politically. And so this has been a huge problem for me since I came to Utah, since 2021. Because same thing, I don't identify just with that side or that side. And so I think kids are ripe for that. But we have to make sure that, maybe we're teaching kids maybe less content and more how to think about the content. Critical thinking skills, contextualization. I have a student who we should get rid of the Constitution. And so obviously we haven't gotten to the Constitution yet and explained what that is. But his idea is that it tells the people what to do. So there's a lot of misinformation that kids come into my class with, and man, it's tough to try to dispel every myth with, here's the other perspective. So I don't see a fix in this until kids will engage in politics, which nobody wants to do, and they see both perspectives. I think the media's job is to vet candidates constantly, whether they're Republican or Democrat or independent or anything else, and our media won't do that right now. Our media is very polarized. And so there are somebody just turned me on to 1440, and it's unbiased news. I follow Jordan is my lawyer on Instagram, and they're news without perspective. And so, I try to tell kids, look, he's saying that's factual. And from the framework that he's making the argument from, that may be factual. This guy might not be a liar. He might have similar or even the same statistics that support his framework for the argument. So it's really hard to teach kids that, you can't just fall into one party or the other. Consider the issue itself. And so that's been a help for me.
So today in the Washington Post, there was an article by Danielle Allen, and she is a professor of poli-sci at Harvard, and she's also, quite involved at the national level with civic education. So she's been doing a series over the past year. And her argument today was that we need a super majority to support constitutional democracy. We need this to be something where at least 2/3 of Americans are saying, yes, I think democracy is important. I support it. And, she mentioned certain norms that then go with the support of constitutional democracy. You accept elections. You don't engage in political violence. You accept the rule of law, things like this. And so that idea that it has to be cross-partisan. But we also know some of the research that the Civic Fulton Leadership Initiative sponsored. Our professor Jada Sart here at UVU found that. People say they support the rule of law until it's their side trying to bend the rules, and then they go soft on it. So I don't know. I guess my question is how do we get that super majority? What do we need to be doing? Teachers in the classroom, students in the classroom, parents. How do we get to that super majority that accepts the norms and the values of constitutional democracy?
I feel like my generation really struggles with talking about politics because most of our education comes from TikTok, and that makes it really difficult to have good views on every single subject. But I grew up internationally. I've lived in 7 different countries, so I've been able to see different school systems in different countries. And 2 that I want to point out were England and Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, every student was required to take a political science class. I took Model UN, which was a fantastic class that forced us to research topics that we didn't want to support. Whether you were pro-choice or pro-life, you would tell what you wanted to do, and then the teacher would assign you to the other side. So you'd have to argue for that side. So it taught us how to do research for ourselves, how to learn both sides of the story. And then the other class that we were required to take was an argumentative class, which taught us how to have good communication skills and actually discuss and debate without getting defensive and without attacking. Because with, especially my generation, there's so much of that in, when you're talking about politics and religion, is that you're wrong, I'm right. And if you start saying that I'm wrong, I'm going to get defensive and say you're wrong, and it gets angry, and there's so much contention. But if you can understand how to actually have a good discussion without the contention and learn both sides, there's truth to both sides, I think it'd be a great start, having some sort of legislation that does that in the state of Utah. I think Mr. Farnsworth was saying that we have to take classes. Start with the young ones, start with the next generation, and then that will be who is running for president in 30 years and 40 years. So I think that's the best place to start is working on classes that they are required to take that can help them with these skills.
Is that on? Okay. I'm from Hawaii, and I went to a private school, and as an octogenarian, I really wonder if you all think that our educational system, K through 12, needs to be more involved in critical thinking and accurate history. We don't have the same foundation. You ask about having a totalitarian group that thinks similarly. Well, we don't have that coming from our K through 12. We're not even being taught today accurate history or critical thinking in our K through 12. If we had a more robust educational system like they have in Finland, like they have in Hong Kong, like they have in private schools, we'd have a chance, I think. But I don't know, that's my question to you. What do you think?
I think we have an actual educator over there who'd like to answer that question. K-12?
Okay, well, okay. Well, and I will say too, I have the benefit right now of seeing schools in 5 districts because I go around and coach student teachers and interns that are graduating from BYU. So in one day, I will see a middle school U.S. history class, and then I will go to a high school and see a government class, and then I'll go to a 6th grade class, and I've seen the spectrum of everything. And honestly, if you want to fix things, you need to invest in the social studies as much as you're investing in STEM. Yes. And that's the problem, because those ones, as working in a K-12 system, and I grew up in Los Angeles and then came here, so I've lived in states on both ends of the spectrum of political class, so it's kind of interesting. And extremism isn't helpful in either case. But I will see that the social studies is like the redheaded stepchild of your core subjects, because there isn't the funding there. We never had a budget like the science, math, or English department. If we asked to have class sizes of 25, our admin were like, what? I'm like, well, English has it. You gave it to the English teachers. How come they have smaller class sizes and we don't? And their whole thing was, well, they're writing essays. And I'm like, okay, well, we want to write essays too and do argumentative essays. We can't do that with 40 kids. And I have 36 desks in my classroom. That is a legitimate experience I had my very first year. I had to have kids, I prayed every day. 2 different kids are absent every single day so that they would have a seat in class so that they could learn. That is the problem right there. We're not funding the education well enough, and then we get shocked that people want to leave the profession. And then we also have this issue where we have people that are getting political in their teaching, and instead of helping students to develop thought, sometimes you see, my students, even though I'm a government teacher, never knew my position. And they still ask me 5 years after being in my classroom, and they still don't know, because I made sure that they understood both sides of the argument well, and that they understood what was going on. But that training sometimes doesn't come, and that isn't helpful, and you have all these constant changes. And I'll tell you, the high school I just taught at, there were 9 of us that helped to open that school, and only 2 people remained there, and it is a department of 12, and there are 6 or 7 first-year teachers teaching in that department. So that school does not have the resources that it needs to help educate this or people with the experience that they need to be able to do that. So if you really want to see the benefit, you need to invest in social science education as much as you're investing in STEM, and give the training that the teachers need to help them do both.
If I could just break in really, really quick. We have people online who I think are writing in comments or questions. Daniel, are there any that want to jump in?
No one yet.
No one, never mind. I think you had your hand up here, yeah?
Something that you said that reminded me is that you said they didn't know your political views. And I think that's so important for kids, is to not know who the people that are influencing them, what their political views are. My mom, she made sure never to tell me her own, but to tell me both sides until I had formed my own opinions, and then she would talk to me about it. But she never said, oh, this is the candidate that I'm voting for. I never knew who she was voting for. She would say, this is what they represent, and this is what the other candidate represents. And I think that having an open mindset early on is one of the most important things.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. Let's bring it back to kind of the foundation of the book here again, which again is that the left-right spectrum is misleading, that there's no essence at the basis of it. And of course, you're still free to break in and say, I disagree with that. The Lewises are wrong. But saying that they're correct, moving on with that, if left and right are not viable political principles, then what political principles should guide constitutionally minded citizens in examining public affairs and policy decisions? If we can't use left and right, well, then what do we use to determine what is the best policy, what's the best direction for our country?
Couple of thoughts there. I think the first thing to do is to understand that plurality is good, and that you don't have to be left or right to make a difference, and maybe actually you can make more difference if you're not. I have people say, well, if we align one tribe really, really, really well, then we can get something done. But what they don't understand is that leads to autocracy, and frankly, it destroys the check and balance system that our Constitution was founded on. And I think we're getting pretty close. So I think recognizing that we need plurality is a first step. For example, if Utah had a Democrat in Congress, when the houses switch, we'd still have representation. But if they don't, we won't. And so plurality, I think, understanding plurality and the need for plurality is a first step. While I have the mic, I'd like to think about how we get to granularity, which is another part of it, that we begin to discuss issues and not parties or tribes or whatever you want to call it. And I wish that we could learn how to get the media, the mainstream media, when they interview candidates, to interview granularity and not let them get away with tribalism. If you have ideas on how we get there, I'd certainly like to. We need to recognize plurality. We need to get to granularity.
Right, so if we can't judge policies based on whether they're adequately conservative or adequately liberal, because these are meaningless terms, so say Verlan and Hyrum, well then how are we judging policies? What political principles are guiding us? Maybe Verlan, you can give your answer to that. If you're stripping us of any ability to speak about policies as good or bad, what principles should we be using to judge?
Yeah, so I think maybe that is a common misconception of the book, and maybe this ties into Professor Hancock's excellent question, which I think gets to the heart of the matter. So our book is not arguing that we should do away with standards by which we can measure what's good and bad. We are arguing for different standards, or rational or useful standards, or standards that are based in reality rather than myth. So I think that would be the distinction. So this gets to, I think, Ralph's question, which is the question of thumos, right? The desire to be a part of a group, the desire to have status, the desire to have honor is an ineradicable feature of human nature. You might say it's a divine aspect of our human nature. So where do we get that sense of identity, that sense of self-respect? Where do we get that sense of feeling good about ourselves, right? And we would say healthy tribes, right? Tribalism is inevitable. We have to have tribes. We have to have groups. But there's some tribes that are healthier than others. And tribes that are based on a myth of left and right are unhealthy tribes. So for me personally, I'm happy to be personal in here. My own faith tradition teaches me that I should find my sense of identity, my sense of self-worth, my sense of self-respect in my relationship to the divine, in my relationship with my church community, in my relationship with my family, in how I treat my neighbors. That's where I get my sense of identity, not in some mythical left or right. Left and right doesn't make me good or bad. These other things are what are a standard for good or bad. So I think the most important public intellectual today, I'll just be candid, is a man by the name of Russell M. Nelson. And he says that we should have identities that are first based on all those things that I talked about. Your relationship to God, to Christ, to your church community, to your family. And he says, be wary of political labels, because when you label yourself politically, you open yourself up to misunderstanding in such a way that people assume things about you. But he says, I don't know anyone who agrees with everything about their preferred political party. Now he acknowledges, and this is what we argue in the book, that of course you're going to have a preferred political party. Of course you're going to prefer one party over the other. That's just statistically probable that one is going to be preferable over the other. That's rational, that's decent, that's, I think, a good way to be a citizen. What's irrational is to say everything in my party is better than everything in the other party. That's where I think the hostility and the violence comes from in our political society, when we say everything that party believes is wrong and evil and everything my party believes is correct and good. And I think that's what James Madison says in Federalist 10. If you don't mind, I'll just quote from this. He says that tribalism is inevitable, that thumos is inevitable, and he says, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. That's inevitable. That's not a problem. As long as the connection subsists between his reason and his self-love, his opinions and his passions will have a reciprocal influence on each other. That's natural. Everyone does that. And the former will be objects to which the latter will attach themselves. Madison's solution to this problem is pluralism. He says, instead of pretending that there's just two groups in society, recognize the truth that there are hundreds of different ways to approach politics. There's hundreds of different groups. There's not just two ways to think about politics. And he lays it out very clearly that that's the way that the Americans can avoid the problem of democratic disintegration. Madison, of course, was a student of history. He'd read widely throughout the history of politics, and he saw that democracies don't typically last very long. They typically expire pretty quickly after they're founded. And he says, how are we going to avoid that? The way we're going to avoid it is by having a large republic. That's never been tried before in world history. We're going to try it. We're going to have a large republic. Rather than having a small republic where you have 2 or 3 factions, and one faction is always exercising majority tyranny on the minority, we're going to have dozens of factions. No one group will ever have a majority, and that's the beauty of pluralism. And if you have a pluralistic society, you will respect constitutional government. You'll care about limited government. You'll care about individual rights. You'll care about the separation of powers, of federalism, of the rule of law. Because you know your group is never going to be in power, and you want to protect your rights. Madison makes this analogy between religious pluralism and political pluralism. He says, how did the Americans come up with religious liberty? That was a new thing in world history. Religious freedom, that's crazy. How did they come up with that idea? It was actually the practice of religious pluralism that led to the idea of religious liberty. There were so many different groups, religious groups in America, that they couldn't impose one group on everyone, one church on everyone. And so they had to, by de facto, have religious freedom. He says, isn't that beautiful? Why can't we do that with politics as well? We can have political freedom if we allow a multiplicity of political groups, rather than the monist delusion that there's only 2 ways to approach politics.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a question on that? So what would you say about, because Federalist 10, the one in the faction, that we now have faction, it's almost as though we have minority over majority, where it's supposed to be majority rule restrained by minority rights. So I use Federalist 10 to talk about faction, and my kids are like, faction? And boom, they start labeling all these groups in society that have their own perspective. So how would you respond to the minority factions almost overtaking the majority?
Yeah, so Madison says the danger of minority tyranny is solved in a democracy by the Republican principle, as he calls it, which is the majority rule. So you will never have a minority being able to tyrannize. Now, I think what you're getting at, or what you're hinting at, is that we have 2 major parties that alternate control of government, that they inevitably have 51% or more of the votes, and sometimes a very small minority within those parties tends to dominate that party. And I think what you're talking about is a product of left-right thinking. So again, to go back to most of American history, we recognize political parties as broad coalitions of different groups, interests, viewpoints, ideas, and people held their parties at an arm's length. They identified with one or the other, but they recognized that this party doesn't represent everything good that I want. It just has more of it than the other party. That's fine. That's rational. But what the left-right spectrum leads us into believing is that everything in this party is right, everything in the other party is wrong. And so if one extreme view comes into power, or one minority view comes into power within one of those parties, everyone in that party has to fall in line lockstep. They can't dissent or disagree with what their party does, because then they are a traitor to their philosophy. Oh, you're not a true conservative because you don't agree with Donald Trump increasing tariffs on trade. Or you're not a true liberal because you don't oppose Israel and you're not pro-Hamas, right? These kind of crazy views we use ideology as a club to beat down dissent within the two major parties. And so that now this very big danger that Madison thought we didn't have to worry about, because there was no left-right spectrum when he wrote the Federalist Papers, is now a big problem in our politics, because we do have these minority groups taking over and everyone just putting their heads down and going along with what the group is doing because they don't want to be excommunicated from the group. And so anyone who dissents, Jeff Flake or whoever, Liz Cheney, they're kicked out of the party because they haven't gone along with everything that the party says.
Thank you. Professor Lewis, I was wondering about this philosophy point that you brought up, that there isn't I think you argue in the book that there isn't a coherent philosophy to the Democratic Party, a coherent philosophy to the Republican Party. There's not this, it's not necessarily all logically consistent. It's almost a random group of things. Is there a coherent philosophy of liberalism? And is there a coherent philosophy of conservatism apart from the party platforms?
Yeah, so that was my first question that I had when my co-author pointed out to me that, is it too bad that conservatives are doing X, Y, and Z? I said, well, that's not true conservatism, right? Because I had my own private definition of what conservatism really was, and what conservatives are doing now is not real conservatism. But the problem with that is because these words are used so frequently and ubiquitously in our political discourse, that everyone will end up having their own private definition of what liberal or conservative means, right? So Thomas Jefferson called himself a liberal very early on after this word was coined by Spanish liberales, was where the word comes from. They were opposed to absolute monarchy. They wanted constitutional monarchy. But of course, Thomas Jefferson called for very different things than what liberals call for today, right? And so if we continue to use the language of liberalism, we're probably confusing more than we're clarifying, right? I think Joe Biden has very different policy preferences from Thomas Jefferson. But according to the left-right spectrum, they're both on the left, right? As if there's some coherent essence connecting them. I don't think there is. And the same thing with conservatism, right? I mean, Donald Trump basically has the opposite policy positions in every respect from Barry Goldwater, but somehow they're both on the right. And the example that we use in this book is the left-right spectrum says that Milton Friedman and Adolf Hitler are both extreme right-wingers. But of course, they were the opposite in every possible way. So the left-right spectrum allows us to insult people and call people names because they happen to be on this side of the spectrum. So I don't think we should be surprised when we use a totalitarian intellectual framework that we end up with totalitarian politics. So this framework emerges, as you know, in Paris in the 1790s. People like Robespierre says there's only two parties. There's the people and their enemies, and we know where that led, right? This monist framework was revived by the Bolshevik revolutionaries in Russia in the 1910s. That didn't end well. And now Americans have decided we want to import this monist framework into our politics. I don't think it will end well if we keep using it.
So in my classroom, I guess there's two quotes I want from your book on my wall. First one is not about who's right, but what's right. So that's the one. And then the other one is truth may not be plural, but the process of getting there should be. And it just kind of reminds me something else you mentioned in your book as well that really stood out to me, and you're getting to that nonstop here, is that accept the idea that our political parties really are tribalism, and I know it has a bad name, especially in American society, but in reality, you guys take on the approach that there's a robust tribalism and there's the dangerous tribalism. A robust tribalism, you guys use as an example, is being Americans of the United States, right? Our government makes decisions, and we are proud to be American citizens. We're patriots for the purpose, but once again, we also keep that at arm's length, knowing that just because our country does something doesn't always mean that what it's doing is correct. And then that's the dialogue we're having with the country. we're not having that with our parties. And that's the first part we need to do, is recognize that our parties are tribalism, but to make it more robust, we have to have that healthy relationship. Thank you.
So I just want to jump in really quickly and say that we're discussing these teams, and Dr. Lewis uses them as Team Blue and Team Red. I think as we're deciding which team that we unite with and align with more, that we should all think of first, have the mental model of Team America. And that we want to have this dedication to the constitutional order, like what Lisa was getting at, that no matter how we're going to behave in politics, what we care about is the system, maintaining and protecting freedoms, and that we have fair elections, and that we consider rights of the minority and others. And so we have this commitment first, we're Team America, and then we can choose which color we want to be and know that it switches, and that there's a plurality within the teams. It's not just left, right. Like when we were talking earlier about talking about both sides, that's reflecting our mental model that there's two sides. And what the book is arguing is that there's two teams dominating, but there's lots of different ways of views within the teams that we're uniting with. So let's be Team America first. So.
Thank you for that great comment, bringing it back. Oh, sorry, right here.
Being that I think everyone would agree that not everybody knows everything and that we're all fallible, I think if we look at the political process as an ongoing one and as one that has always existed, I listened to, I can't remember the name of the stock guy, the old guy. I don't remember, but he said when he was a kid growing up during the Depression in the United States, he said his father wouldn't let him have dessert unless he said something bad about Roosevelt. And I think this is just a constant thing. We're always going to be different, and I think we should celebrate the possibilities and hold to that. And I think one of the things I've heard when I was a student, that one of the problems with America is that we all want things to happen right now, right today. We want to figure things out. And we watch too many one-hour TV programs where it's all resolved in an hour. But if we just hang on to the unity of this great experiment of democracy and being open to the possibilities and to be open to conversation and to try to transcend our own egos and to be a little more open to hearing alternate views and to I think love the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of happiness, and just love the potential we have as Americans. I think it's a great thing.
Thank you. I think it's time maybe to wrap it up with some closing thoughts from our esteemed panelists up here. For one, I've really appreciated the way Verlan explained that one way to help heal American politics is to stop identifying with a righteous tribe, but to instead see ourselves see the tribes for what they are, which are simply tribes that don't possess all righteous knowledge and etc., and be able to speak to each other again in more productive and efficient and healthy ways. So let's get some final thoughts here from Stockton and from Becky and from Verlan.
Yeah, I'm really thankful for everyone's thoughts. I learned a lot from you guys and your opinions and your thoughts. I kind of wanted to go back to your thought over there, talking about politics in school, or just like a diversity of views in school. I grew up in California, and it was very easy to tell kind of where my teachers leaned. But I think one of the most memorable teachers that I had back then was this professor, or this teacher that would just kind of really push people to kind of go out of their comfort zone. I remember he was an English teacher, and he came to school one day with like a Trump hat on. And this was, I was in high school, so it would have been before 2019. So it was just really interesting to see people's thoughts and opinions, and it would kind of encourage people to talk about this and to really kind of step out of their comfort zone. And I think that's really something that is kind of lacking in our school, or in our school system today, is kind of like this diversity of thoughts and opinions on politics, and stuff like that. I mean, I personally think it's really unfortunate too that when we're talking about religion as well, and diversity of religions, that it's not until like college where I've taken a philosophy class where they're talking about intro to Western religions that like you actually learn more about what's out there in the world and what Muslim people actually believe and think, or what, Judaism, like what Jews believe and think. And I think that's really unfortunate that a lot of our elementaries and junior highs and high schools don't have that involved. So I think those are just kind of my last thoughts. So
Thank you.
I have a few thoughts about conversations with people who have different opinions and how we can make those more productive. And I've seen over and over in political settings where, of course, as a legislator, you're trying to gain someone's vote. So you have an end in sight, which is ideally you're convincing them and they give you their vote. But before you even get to that point, and probably long-term, what's more productive is having a conversation with someone who has a different opinion on an issue or an idea, and you help create a pathway for them to exit their belief. That's very, very hard when you are a deeply embedded person in a tribe to say, how do I leave this whole thing that is part of who I am? It's part of what I've always been in my family and my community and whatnot. How do I step away from that? And what's on the other side of that place? And helping find some pieces of stone or puzzle pieces or whatever that you can pull from the good things that they have held on to in their tribe and say, look, that also belongs over here too. And we're going to create a shared pathway. And having the patience and the temperament to do that, I think, helps give people the ability to learn, gives ourselves the ability to learn as well, to learn, to change, to grow, and to evolve together to create healthier tribes, to create systems that encourage a thoughtful approach to politics, to discussions, to our world. And I think it's also just a generous, sort of a nice thing to do as a human, to create an opportunity for people to grow without demonizing them in that process.
Yeah, I'll just add by maybe disagreeing with Dr. Eccles here or at the very end, and I actually think we should find righteous tribes. I just don't think those are left or right, and I don't think there are political parties. So I think the Center for Constitutional Studies is a righteous tribe. I think it's doing good things. I think we should find a sense of identity in this center that we have here at UVU, and I think that's perfectly healthy. What I think is unhealthy is when we invent false tribes and endow them with righteousness that does not exist. Neither political party, as Becky Edwards said, has a monopoly on truth or goodness, and so we need to look at it that way. So I would say, to that your question earlier, what would be your primary passion, or where would you want to direct those thumatic passions that are inherent in human nature? I would say into constitutional government. So we sit here in an auditorium right now and have an open discussion about politics. This could not happen in lots of countries around the world that do not have constitutional self-government, that have tyranny, that have despotism. What a marvelous thing that is, that we are here free to share different ideas and disagree. And that's fine, and the government's not going to put us in jail for disagreeing. But I worry that freedom is at risk in our political society if we forget about the important bulwarks against government tyranny that our Constitution provides, including federalism, the separation of powers, the rule of law, popular sovereignty, and individual rights. So I would say that is what we should focus on, and then we can criticize or praise particular groups or parties to the extent that they conform or diverge from those principles. That's what I would end with.
Great, thank you. Really quick, we need to say thank you to all the people in the back here, all the staff who made this possible, who provided the lunch and the setup. So if we could just give them a hand real quick and say thank you. That was great. And then we'll turn it back to Alicia.
Thank you so much for coming. Our next book club session is on May 16th. We are reading Revolutionary Mothers by Carol Birkin. It's a book about this thick, so it's not very big, and it's telling the stories of women during the American War of Independence. And as a center, we also have one of our flagship conferences coming up, our First Amendment Conference, which is on March 20th. We're talking about, or it's called Some Assembly Required, and we're talking about the freedom of association and the freedom of assembly. And then we also have another series that we are just beginning to run. It's called Learners with Littles. We're trying to reach others in the community that would like to learn about American heritage, but if they have small children at home, it's hard to find caregivers for them. So they could bring the children, and the adults get to have discussion about reading, while the children in the same room have crafts and learning on their level what the parents are learning. So look at our website to sign up for that, and also sign up for the next book club, and we hope to see you there. And thank you so much for coming.